Elizabethan society was organised around a hierarchy that fitted in with people's ideas about the great chain of being. And the most important people in it were the nobility, followed by the gentry, followed by the yeomanry, followed by the labouring poor, and with vagabonds, the really destitute and poverty-stricken, at the bottom. But Elizabeth has the problem in this population of a few million people of making sure that everybody follows her laws and her policies. So this section is on Elizabeth's government. And actually this social hierarchy plays a part in that, because one of Elizabeth's powers, there she is, was to issue something called patronage. She could be a patron. And this meant that she could award money or land or jobs or some other form of support to the people that she chose, usually members of the nobility, but it could include the gentry as well. They then had the option of being patrons to the people with less status than them, who could then provide patronage to the people beneath them in the social hierarchy. So this is quite a good way of keeping control, because it means that everybody is trying to keep the people above them in the social hierarchy happy, in the hope that they will receive patronage. So that's one of Elizabeth's powers. She's also able to declare war and also declare not war, declare peace. And she was sometimes asked to rule in legal cases, particularly if the law wasn't clear or if people disagreed with the judge and appealed against their decision. So those are some of her powers. Now, before we get onto the government, there's one group that's really important to mention, although they're not technically a part of the government. This is something called court. Court is basically a group of around 500 people who went everywhere with the Queen and basically acted as her advisors and her personal servants, and really sort of her friends as well. So the people in court were known as courtiers, and they were usually members of the nobility who had been invited to join court by the Queen. Nobody could join court without the Queen's permission. Women from noble and important families might become the Queen's ladies-in-waiting, and that meant that they were her personal servants, really, but it also meant that they were keeping her informed of the things that are going on. Now, obviously, court is really influential because they're spending their time with the Queen. They would travel with her when she went to stay in different palaces. If she went to stay with a noble family, the court would go too. But they're also there as well for entertainment. So they spend a lot of time doing things like hunting and music and dancing and riding and sports. And this is fun, but it's also a really good way of showing off England's wealth and power. So court is not a part of the government, but it's really, really influential. The most important part of Elizabeth's government is something called the Privy Council. Now, this always makes me snigger a bit because privy is also the word for a Victorian toilet. It's like history teacher humour. But actually privy just means private. So this is a small group of the Queen's most trusted advisors, and it was made up of courtiers, perhaps, and nobles and advisors, and sometimes as well members of the gentry were included in it. And the Privy Council is responsible for law and order. It's responsible for security in England and things like intelligence and finding out what's going on. And also it's responsible for local government, so the councils in counties and towns. Make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to as well. It's a small group. It was about 19 people. Elizabeth's sister Mary I had a much, much bigger Privy Council, but Elizabeth preferred to keep hers quite small because it was manageable that way. And they would meet up 3 times a week. They would debate and discuss what was going on in the country, and they would also advise the Queen. And they oversaw other officials. Now, some of the jobs in the Privy Council, whoops, I'm just going to move that up. I wrote it out beforehand because they're quite long. They're a bit of a pain otherwise. But some of the jobs in the Privy Council include the Lord High Admiral, who was responsible for the Navy. One of my more excellent boats there. The Lord Chamberlain was responsible for the Queen's household. The Lord Treasurer was responsible for the finances and the money. And then the Secretary of State was perhaps the most important position because they were the closest to the Queen and they advised her on the most important matters. Now, between 1558 and 1573, the Secretary of State is a man called William Cecil. After that, he's the Lord Treasurer. He's a really important figure in Elizabethan government. So there he is. But the Privy Council overall is really important because it makes sure that Elizabeth's instructions are carried out. As well as the Privy Council, there is also, if we come over here, Parliament. And this has 2 houses. It's actually really hard to find out what Parliament looked like in Elizabethan times because, of course, it burnt down in 1666. So this is my best guess based on the research. But in Parliament, there were 2 houses. The upper house was known as the House of Lords. And that contained about 100 people. And it was made up of nobles and also judges and also bishops. There's then the lower house, which is called the House of Commons. And that's made up of about 450 people who are usually members of the gentry class. So gentlemen, squires, merchants, lawyers, people like that. Now, Elizabeth needs Parliament for a number of reasons. The first is that they can issue laws, which are called Acts of Parliament. So, Acts of Parliament. Now, the Queen can't do this. She can issue something called proclamations. So I'll put that over here. Proclamations, but they don't count in the courts and they don't get recorded as law. So sometimes she needs Parliament to pass a law as an act, and actually it works the other way as well. She has to agree any acts that get passed. She also needs Parliament to grant something called extraordinary taxation. The Queen actually has an income and she was getting money in anyway, but sometimes she needed extra money for things like wars. So when that happened, Parliament had to raise it and collect it and give it to her. So sometimes she needed Parliament to raise extraordinary taxation. The other thing that Parliament is for offering advice, although she doesn't always appreciate this. But Parliament does have the role of offering the Queen advice about things. And if Elizabeth needed Parliament for anything, then she would call it. She was the person who called and dismissed Parliament. Okay, so she could gather them together, or she could dismiss them and send them home. They're actually not called all that often in Elizabethan times. It's estimated that Parliament only met up for about 3 weeks of the year. Whenever Parliament was called, there would be an election. The candidates for the House of Commons were chosen by the Privy Council. And the only people who could vote were a teeny tiny number of very, very rich people. So usually the seats went uncontested. Parliament would then meet up and fulfil what the Queen needed. They did sometimes clash with the Queen, particularly over something called royal prerogative. There were some things that were seen as being purely the business of the monarch and something that only the Queen could decide about. So in Elizabeth's time, this included foreign policy and how England got on with other countries. It included her marriage, or lack of it, or her options for marriage. And it included succession and who was going to take the throne when she died. Elizabeth did not like Parliament talking about any of these things. Parliament, on the other hand, sometimes felt that this was its business, and there is an issue about freedom of speech. So sometimes they fall out with Elizabeth about this, and when that happens, she might send some members of Parliament to the Tower. An MP called Peter Wentworth complained in 1576 and got sent to the Tower of London for a week. So there's Parliament as well. Finally, there are some law enforcement roles that are directly answerable to the Queen. So the first of these is, there he is, something called the Lord Lieutenant. It's spelt lieutenant. I believe Americans call it a lieutenant. However, I call it a lieutenant, for I am British. So the Lord Lieutenant was usually a member of the nobility, and very often, actually, a member of the Privy Council as well. So we'll just draw an arrow leading to here. And they would be responsible for a part of the country, and in that part of the country, they would be responsible for making sure that Elizabeth's laws were enforced. They would oversee local government, make sure they were doing as they were told. And they were also responsible for the local militia. This was when they needed soldiers. They might get ordinary people to fight, and the Lord Lieutenant was responsible for calling them up and also for organising them. There's also a group of people in law enforcement called the Justices of the Peace. And these were overseen by the Privy Council, and they're really responsible for making sure that people follow an awful lot of Elizabeth's laws. By 1600 they were enforcing over 300 laws, and sometimes they were complaining that they had too much to do. And they would do things like give licences to pubs, and they would check bridges and roads, and they would issue arrest warrants as well. They were usually members of the gentry. This was one way that patronage could work. A member of the gentry might be made a justice of the peace. And they would sit 4 times a year in something called the quarter sessions, where they would act as magistrates for trials involving serious crimes. So if we zoom out, we can see that this is how Elizabeth controlled the country.